Hey, a year in review video and it's kind of almost on time for once. As usual, this isn't a Games of the Year list, but rather an overview of all the games I played this year, the same as every year. Most of the time I'll be showing my own footage, but similar to last year's video, I'll use official game trailers for anything that I don't have access to. I heard good things about this game, and I like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies well enough, but I cannot give this a recommendation. The combat is serviceable, but it's pretty damn repetitive, boring, and very easy, even on the highest difficulty. The story and dialogue has its moments, but it's ruined by the constant forced banter from all the characters. They just don't know when to shut up. It can be funny at times, and I understand that the characters are written faithfully, but the humor gets old fast and ends up being insufferable. All of this isn't quite a deal breaker, but on top of everything, the game is surprisingly glitchy and unstable. Not enough to be unplayable, I did see the game all the way to the end, but it is there enough to be noticeable and it's inexcusable. I think if you're a huge Guardians of the Galaxy fan, then this is probably worth it. Like, the game's not horrible, and I'm sure there are a ton of references to the original comics, so it certainly feels like a good bit of love and care went into fleshing out the world. But the game on its own merits falls flat. Scantily clad anime ladies with katanas battling zombies. Pretty much what you see is what you get. The story is so stupid and bad that it's almost laughable, but it never quite gets to be enjoyable enough for that. The gameplay is very simple and straightforward, and while the timing for attacks, dodges, and parries can be awkward at first, you eventually do get used to it and the game can be pretty fun. Using a total of 4 weapons across 2 different characters also helps with the gameplay variety. However, even at its best, it's a pretty mindless and very short game, even on the hard difficulty. Some of the boss fights are cool, but you're really not missing out on much if you never play this. I like music games and I like Final Fantasy's music. Sounds like it would be a match made in heaven. It's just okay. I had already played Curtain Call a good bit on the 3DS, and it's really nice to play this franchise again with a much better controller. The library is massive, with about 400 songs across 20 or so different games, including some lesser-known mobile games. It's hard to complain with a soundtrack that huge, but there are so many repeated remixes and variations. I am so sick of hearing all the different versions of Battle on the Big Bridge and Genova after all this. The single-player challenges are also pretty annoying since half of them require min-maxing a specific party makeup to complete. And if you're still losing even after getting a perfect combo on the hardest difficulty, then there's not much else you can do other than grinding and leveling up. It's still a good music game with a massive library, but it doesn't really do anything special. I was looking forward to this game for a long time, and I am shocked at how disappointing this ended up for me. Some of the usual River City elements are here, like the open world map and RPG stats, but the game is so linear and straightforward that the open world and side quests don't add up to much, and there's not a whole lot there in terms of RPG customization either. The combat is a ton of fun when you get it to work properly. It takes a while to unlock some of the better special moves, but once you do, it's really cool to string together combos and juggles. However, the game can also be too picky for its own good. Stomping on grounded enemies can be annoyingly precise, and weapon pickups feel more like a detriment since you lose access to most of your moveset. Worst of all, enemies will just get invulnerability frames out of nowhere if you stun lock them too well, so you're forced to back off and give them breathing room constantly. On top of everything, the story tries way too hard to be funny. It is insanely obnoxious and goes on forever with nothing really happening. The game is fun for the most part, and it's cool to play in co-op, but it's crazy how many aspects try to sabotage the experience, and it left me with a bad taste. There is a lot of good here, and the game's combat is really fun during its best moments, but they tried too hard with meshing disparate elements that don't gel together too well and get in the way of what the game does best. After a good 8 years of playing this game on and off leading up to the end of Shadowbringers, I had gotten pretty invested in the story of Final Fantasy XIV. And I finally took the time to see to its conclusion with Endwalker. I have mixed feelings. Endwalker is obviously a ridiculous fanservice feast with a bunch of characters coming back and plotlines wrapping up, which is cool at times, and at other times it gets a little annoying. It is pretty odd that the Garlean Empire, the big evil country that's been threatening the world since day one, is condensed to a single, comparatively tiny map. The origins of the Ashians, Zodiac, and Hydaelyn are all finally explained, and while it is pretty contrived, I accept that it's about the best you're gonna get for such a long-running story. I feel like the expansion could have easily been split into 2 separate ones, but it's not like the pacing was too rushed, and it was overall pretty good. I didn't care much for the newly added Sage job, but I do respect how unique it is, while the Reaper quickly became a huge favorite of mine. Great dungeons and bosses, and while I liked Shadowbringers more overall, I found Endwalker to still be a really good time and a fairly decent way to wrap up this decade-long story arc. However, the quality of the story dropped quickly in the post-game content, in particular with a focus on the newly introduced character Zero, and I got really tired of Final Fantasy XIV early on into Dawntrail. Maybe I'll have more to say if I ever return, but I didn't like what I played of the expansion, and I could tell that I still had a long way to go. At least for the time being, I'm happy with laying Final Fantasy XIV to rest. I liked Moving Out 1 a good bit, more than I expected, and the sequel was great at first, mostly being more of the same with a bunch of new gimmicks. Unfortunately, the gimmicks are kind of all this game has. The first game relied more so on clever level design to uphold its simple premise, while the second game has a lot more simpler levels, but with annoying obstacles. Also, I could be misremembering things, but the first game was a lot funnier to me. The writing in this one is just really annoying. It's not bad at all, and if you like the first game, then the sequel is still fine to check out. The same basic idea is still there, carry furniture in wacky scenarios, and it's still plenty of fun with a friend. But I guess the concept got played out for me at this point, and I wasn't feeling the sequel so much. But David, if you hate roguelikes so much, then why do you keep playing them?
Because I've lost control of my life.
I played 3 roguelikes this year, and I was more okay with them than usual because the randomization was toned down quite a bit. In Wizard of Legend, you have to navigate a series of procedurally generated dungeons filled with enemies, traps, and treasure, and take down the bosses at the end. The action is very fast-paced and chaotic, which takes some getting used to, and it doesn't help that it's extremely easy to die from a series of sudden cheap shots, so you always have to approach every room very carefully. You'll have to grind a good amount to unlock, well, anything worthwhile, but eventually you'll find that there's a pretty massive amount of spells to choose from to customize your own preferred playstyle. Unfortunately, the game is so absurdly bloated that the vast majority of these spells are either severely outclassed or just straight up useless. Instead of creating a variety of interesting loadouts, you're more likely to find a broken build or two and just stick with that. I think my biggest problem of all are the enemy interactions. Most enemies are easily stun-locked to death, and you have to rely on those kind of broken combos that don't allow enemies to recover because it can be devastating to have your attacks interrupted. Even stupider is how all the bosses follow a similar formula. They do a series of overwhelming attacks that you need to focus on dodging, and then they'll purposely leave themselves open for a long combo afterwards. And literally every boss is like this, which makes their design come off as pretty lazy. The game does control well, and the action is fast and exciting, but every step forward in the game's design is marred by another step back. Now, at least the local co-op works really well, although the zoomed-in camera does make it feel rather claustrophobic. It's not bad at all, and I had a ton of fun beating this game, but I wasn't exactly rushing back in for more afterwards. Colt Canyon was probably my most unassuming and pleasant surprise this year. It's such a simple game, but it sets out to do its specific thing quite well. You play as a rootin' cowboy on a quest to rescue your significant other from the clutches of evil bandits across a vast and deadly prairie. Ammunition and supplies are limited, so kill anyone who gets in your way and take their weapons for your own. Despite essentially being a roguelike and it being so easy to die, the game isn't as obnoxiously difficult as the genre tends to be. Slow and steady and staying focused are necessary for sneaking up on enemies and avoiding traps, but quick reflexes and good aim are just as important. Most of all, the game feels fair, or at least about as fair as a roguelike can get. Supplies are usually plentiful enough, so as long as you play carefully and you don't waste too much ammo, you can usually avoid getting in bad situations. My only big complaint is that the maps are pretty huge, which seems fine at first, but when you're exploring every corner for upgrades and supplies before moving on, it can get annoying, especially without any sort of a minimap, which makes it easy to get lost. It's also worth noting that if you're a super hardcore roguelike fan, there's probably not much for you here. The game's definitely on the easier side, but I found it to be a ton of fun, it controls well, and there's plenty of characters and weapons for variety. Not only is it good as a single-player game, but it's even better in co-op, partly thanks to an emphasis on sharing from the same ammo pool, which encourages both players to focus on different playstyles and weapon types. It might not be anything too special, but this is just a cool, simple, and fun game. For the King was cool, I enjoyed it well enough, but I also feel like it was a little too simple and bland. The sequel overhauls the combat system and gives players a ton more options to work with without being too overwhelming. The writing is a lot better and funnier, and the gameplay is better balanced and less frustrating too. While the combat is a little slower paced, it's still such a massive improvement overall that I would recommend just playing this one over the original. It is annoying how the sequel's collection of mini-campaigns has your party constantly starting over from level 1, instead of continuing the overarching adventure more seamlessly, which is how the first game was handled, but the new maps are well made with unique and fun gimmicks, and the whole system does work out well enough. Just like the first game, this is a great, light Dungeons & Dragons type of experience with friends, and while it's perfectly playable single player, I say it's best played in co-op. Grim Dawn is a top-down action RPG where you take on massive hordes of enemies and monstrous bosses. Basically a bit of a Diablo 2 ripoff. The story and dialogue are dark, dreary, and maybe a little too edgy. It's definitely way too heavy on the lore and text. There's so much reading in this game that I ended up skipping past at least half of it. However, the raw gameplay is on point. You get a lot of abilities at your disposal, but unfortunately for me, most of the combat boiled down to spamming about 5 abilities by constantly and mindlessly mashing the number keys on my keyboard, and I'd have a couple more moves on the side for when a situation comes up, but there's not really much to it. However, proper positioning and dodging attacks is still fun, and there's plenty to explore in the game's overworld and many dungeons. The main appeal is in its customization, giving players a ton of options to build their character in a way that feels unique. Once you get in deeper, you'll find the astrological grid to be way too massive and needlessly complicated to understand what leads where. It also sucks that once you've chosen your class and subclass, you're locked in for that character, which feels bad when your expectation doesn't quite turn out with what you end up with, and you have to start the game all over again just to try something else. All these complaints aside, Grim Dawn is solidly made and has a good old classic feel to it that's easy to pick up and fun throughout. And it's even better in co-op, where having differing builds can really shine. Whether as an alternative to Diablo 2, or even for judging it on its own merits, Grim Dawn is pretty good, and I would recommend it. Yet another lesser-known indie turn-based RPG to throw in the pile. And while it's hardly my favorite, Virgo vs. the Zodiacs is very creative both in presentation and in gameplay. It tells a tale of personified star constellations and other celestial bodies that are at odds with each other, and Virgo is on a mission to take all of their crowns, by murder if need be, in order to forcibly shape the universe to her wishes. The tone of the story is pretty dark, but it's juxtaposed by cutesy art and whimsical characters. Yet, it all strikes a good balance and none of it feels like it clashes, at least not too badly. The combat is especially creative. Status ailments and buffs are very flexible, allowing them to stack up to 3 levels, but they can also be easily overridden. If a boss has a powerful buff, then you can give them a different buff that's easier to manage, which in turn erases the previous one. It's a surprisingly robust system that can lead to some open-ended combat possibilities. This is in addition to a rock-paper-scissors style strengths and weaknesses setup, as well as timed button presses on both offense and defense, and a ton of equipment that makes a pretty big difference in customizing your party. The game is a bit janky and a little cheap looking in a lot of ways, but give it a chance and you'll see that it has some real soul behind it, and it's pretty fun. Ship of Fools is one of the best co-op roguelikes that I've ever played. You and your partner must navigate a vast sea filled with perils and treasures using 2 cannons to defend yourselves from all kinds of monstrosities. While it is playable in single player, co-op is far more exciting and fun, with both players separating and coming together in tandem to attack, repair, reload, and generally defend the ship. Despite being pretty random and having a run's difficulty based largely on what ammo types you come across on your adventure, the game is fairly generous about giving you good stuff to work with, and you can improve your odds further with the special pulls after each boss. You have several characters and boats to choose from, each with their own pros and cons, and the game gets easier the more you play as you unlock several permanent upgrades. The main objective comes down to completing the full game several times over, about 20 or so successful runs in total, with each level significantly buffing the enemy opposition until you finally complete all the challenges. It seems extremely daunting at first, but with practice, you'll find yourself juggling all of your tasks efficiently, and it's always cool to successfully parry enemy projectiles. It's so awesome to have the right co-op partner to play this with, forming strategies and game plans together, and so satisfying to see it all come together and reach that ending multiple times as the game gets harder and harder. I don't know if I'd recommend this game just for the single player. It's fine, but it's not the main draw and you're missing out on a lot, but it is a fantastic co-op game. I love Nioh and Stranger Paradise for the fast action and tough as nails challenge, but I've only played them solo. Going through Nioh 2 in co-op was a vastly different experience, and I'm glad it was both smooth and a lot of fun. The game's difficulty is tuned up a little more in co-op, with stronger enemies and in greater numbers scattered about, but it's still much easier to have 2 people gang up on a single target no matter how you look at it. There's even a revive mechanic to keep players in the fight, although dying too many times will still lead to a game over. Best of all, the annoyances typical with the co-op implementation of Dark Souls are absent here. Join a lobby, pick a mission, complete the dungeon, simple as that. Aside from one or two mandatory single-player missions, nearly the entire game is playable in co-op, and it is a very seamless experience. Not being able to trade items and somewhat cumbersome menus brings down the game a little, and a lot of missions are pretty long, which can be tough to fit in people's schedules. But the raw moment-to-moment gameplay is on point. As for the game itself, it's mostly the same as the first game, but with some rather unnecessary additions in my opinion. The new yokai shift mechanic doesn't add that much, and it can actually limit your customization options a lot if you want to stick with a particular parry style. I much prefer Stranger of Paradise, but all three of these games are awesome, whether you play them solo or with a friend. It's hard to describe what Crow Country is going for. It has elements of classic survival horror, but with an oddly humorous atmosphere, and you can tell that the developers were having some stupid fun making this game. Despite how silly it can be at times, the story and lore is interesting to follow, and while there is a ton of text to read, it just about avoids being overbearing and overly wordy. The combat is kind of annoying. It's a pain to aim your gun, but this is clearly done on purpose to dissuade combat and only do so as a last resort, which is in line with what traditional survival horrors would be going for. Supplies always feel limited too, but I wouldn't be surprised if items are dynamically placed just so the game can help you up after kicking you down. I'm not a fan of that, but similar to Resident Evil 4, it does stay mostly unobtrusive. The weapon variety and enemy variety are a little bit low, and there's only one boss, but the puzzles are cool, the maps are well designed, and there are a ton of secrets to uncover, some of which are more than a little ridiculous to find, but I digress. Crow Country may look like it's just a simple budget survival horror, and to be fair, it is, but give this game a chance and you'll find it was made with love by fans who understand the genre and successfully put their own twist on the formula. It's not my favorite survival horror, but man, this is a good one. Like I already said, Stranger of Paradise is my favorite of the Team Ninja action RPGs. I've already done a review of this game, so I encourage you to check out that video for my more detailed thoughts. Much of what I said about Nioh 2 applies here as well. Playing in co-op with the option to revive yourself and teammates makes the game a hell of a lot easier. This is doubly so with party-wide healing jobs such as Sage and White Mage. I very much enjoyed taking on a healing role in this game because you're pushed into actively participating in combat in order to restore your MP, and a good healer will keep the party alive far beyond what they should be allowed. My favorite aspect about this game is the combat, with the break gauge and soul shield mechanics working in tandem with each other perfectly to create a constant flow of high risk, high reward. However, the game's harsh difficulty often steamrolls the player as well. One mistake can very quickly and very easily lead to your demise. I don't mind that style at all, but I do understand how frustrating it can be for others. In particular, my fiancée was just not having it, but we did see the game through to the end and it was enjoyable overall. I also appreciate how most of the maps are pretty straightforward, which I much prefer over Nioh 1 and 2's ridiculous mazes. And I love the way that Stranger of Paradise makes it easy to swap between different weapons and jobs and rewards the player for trying out different playstyles. I'd also be remiss if I didn't at least mention the story. It is so bad and so stupid that it comes off as being legitimately hilarious. My fiancé and I might come back to this sometime to try out the DLC content, hopefully with a better PC because the Steam Deck can struggle to run this game. But just for the base game alone, this was a ton of fun to revisit. Silent Hill has had a rough history. Despite there being so many sequels, no entry has ever come close to matching the greatness of the original trilogy, until now. The developers at Neobards clearly understood the atmosphere and tone to go for with the Silent Hill game, and doubly impressive considering the radically different setting. There's even a lot of subtle allusions to previous entries, but Silent Hill F is mostly doing its own thing with great characters, dialogue, and acting, all going a long way to support the excellent story. As expected of a survival horror game, there's a huge pile of documents to read through, but the lore is interesting enough, and it's pretty fun to piece it all together. While it's typical for a Silent Hill game to feature multiple endings, Neobards did something unique here by telling an overarching story in which each ending reveals a piece of the whole until it all wraps up in a very satisfying finale. This does mean that you'll need to beat the whole game several times to get the intended experience, which can certainly drag after a while. However, Neobards was pretty friendly about it by shortening some segments and allowing later chapters to be skipped entirely on subsequent playthroughs. But you are still going to have to play through a good 70% of the game each time. Thankfully, the combat is pretty fun, with stamina, dodge, and counter mechanics all working together well to keep the action exciting. Collecting all the different accessories and coming up with your own build is a ton of fun too, although you don't get the really good ones until after you've beaten the game once. The leveling system is an interesting direction to go in for a Silent Hill game, and points are only granted by sacrificing items, which encourages exploration and dissuades combat. Although some of its mechanics, such as limited inventory space and weapon durability, don't actually mean all that much. If you do your due diligence and explore fairly well, then you'll have no problems finding tons of replacement weapons and supplies. And while the town of Ibisugaoka is large with plenty to see and lots of optional secrets to discover, it still feels much smaller than the towns of the previous games. All said, this is a masterful and original take on such a storied franchise. I'm still shocked that Neobards pulled it off this well, and it was really tough for me not to give this the #1 spot this year. But a different, original IP floored me in ways I did not expect. It's easy to dismiss Another Crab's Treasure as a janky Dark Souls ripoff, but hear me out. This has more going for it than it initially seems. The controls take some getting used to and can feel a little floaty. The platforming in particular can be an issue at times, but with practice, the dodge, parry, and counter mechanics will all start to feel very natural. It doesn't give you the same kind of crazy, satisfying parries as Devil May Cry 5 or Sekiro, but Another Crab's Treasure has its own style that feels really unique and satisfying to pull off. Central to its gameplay is the ability to find and swap out different garbage to use as makeshift hermit crab shells, with each one having their own unique stats and abilities. While it seems like a silly gimmick at first, it helps make exploration satisfying while also naturally adding a layer of strategy to the boss arenas and other environments. Despite leveling up stats and a small skill tree, the core gameplay remains very tight and largely unchanged throughout, which I appreciate. The game stays focused on its strengths and avoids bloating itself with unnecessary mechanics. Wrapped around the solid gameplay is a world and story that surprised me. The maps are definitely large enough to give that sense of scale and adventure, but rarely so much so that it becomes overwhelming or too easy to get lost in. I could have done without the obligatory poison swamp, but at least it's a hell of a lot less offensive than any of the Dark Souls games. The myriad of secrets naturally lead the player to explore and stumble upon several optional areas, equipment, and bosses. And it feels really appropriate for a character that has been forcibly thrust into this world. The protagonist, Krill, just wants to be left alone, but is called to action to retrieve his stolen shell. Along the way, he faces off with multiple villainous characters, including a corrupt capitalist leader, and he becomes the hero of the poor and downtrodden in a world that's drowning in pollution and plastics. It sounds like a story that's been told 1,000 times, but the writing takes some unexpected turns. Most of all in the fact that Krill wants nothing to do with it. While everyone takes advantage of Krill's position as an unlikely hero, all he wants to do is get back what he's due. And he means it. Despite having an anti-pollution and anti-capitalist setting, the story avoids being preachy and simply presents the world as it is without offering any kind of solution. It's that earnest presentation that really made me respect Another Crab's Treasure and drew me into its world. The story turned out far better than what I was expecting, and the gameplay is rock solid good. There's hardly a major flaw here that I can think of, on top of it being such a pleasant surprise. It's not among my all-time favorites, but it certainly is up there. Silent Hill F was a strong contender, but I have to give it to Another Crab's Treasure as my personal game of the year. I expected more out of the early games on this list, and I ended up disappointed, especially with how River City Girls turned out. Quite a few surprises this year though. Colt Canyon, Ship of Fools, Crow Country, Silent Hill F, and Another Crab's Treasure were all games that turned out much better than I expected. Thankfully, nothing was downright terrible. Even Guardians of the Galaxy and Onee Chanbara were at least playable, compared to all the absolute trash that I've played in the past. A good year overall, and I'm looking forward to doing it all again next year. For anyone still watching, see you all next year and beyond.